The morning sky was clear and bright as students gathered in front of Oakwood High School. 15 students from Mrs. Wilson's senior class waited eagerly for their annual trip to Forest Creek Nature Reserve. This was a trip that students looked forward to all year, a chance to learn outside classroom walls and explore the beauty of nature. Among the students was Emma Chen, a quiet girl with a passion for photography. She had her camera ready, hoping to capture the rare birds that nested in the reserve. Next to her stood Tyler Rodriguez, the class president who had organized most of the trip details with Mrs. Wilson. He checked his list one final time, making sure everyone was present. "Is everyone here?" called Mrs. Wilson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. She had been taking students on this trip for 15 years without any problems. "Please check that you have all your things before we board." The students responded with excited chatter as they picked up their backpacks. Some parents stood nearby, waving and taking photos of their children. It was just another school trip, one of many that happened every year at Oakwood High. "Remember to stay together at all times," Mrs. Wilson reminded them as they climbed onto the yellow school bus. "We should reach Forest Creek in about 3 hours." The bus driver, Mr. Jenkins, greeted each student with a smile. He had been driving this route for over a decade and knew the roads well. As the last student boarded, he closed the door and started the engine. "Everyone buckle up," he said, adjusting his mirror to see all 15 students and Mrs. Wilson settling into their seats. The bus pulled away from the school at exactly 8:30 a.m. Parents waved until the bus turned the corner and disappeared from view. None of them knew this would be the last time they would see the bus with their children on it. For the first hour, the journey was normal. Students listened to music, played card games, or stared out the windows at the changing landscape. The city buildings gradually gave way to open countryside and then to the thick forests that surrounded their destination. At 9:45 a.m., Mrs. Wilson sent a text message to the school principal. "All going well. Students excited. Should reach Forest Creek by noon." This was the last communication anyone would receive from the bus. As they entered the forest area, the road became narrower and winding. Mr. Jenkins navigated carefully, slowing down at each sharp turn. The trees grew thicker on both sides, creating shadows across the road even though it was mid-morning. "The forest feels different today," noted Rachel Lee, who had visited the reserve multiple times with her family. "It's so quiet." She was right. The usual sounds of birds and wildlife seemed absent. Even the students gradually became quieter, many now looking out the windows with curiosity rather than excitement. At 10:20 a.m., the bus passed the "Welcome to Forest Creek" sign. Mr. Jenkins took the left fork in the road that would lead them to the education center where they planned to meet their guide. What happened next remains unknown. At 1:30 p.m., when the bus failed to arrive at the education center, staff called the school. By 3:00 p.m., police were searching the route. At 4:17 p.m., they found the school bus parked neatly on the side of the forest road. The bus was empty. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. 15 backpacks were still on the seats. 15 packed lunches remained untouched. Mrs. Wilson's clipboard with the attendance list lay on the front seat. But of the 15 students, their teacher, and the bus driver, there was no sign at all. The discovery of the empty bus sent shockwaves through the small town of Millfield. Police officers carefully examined the abandoned vehicle, looking for any clues about what might have happened. Detective Sarah Morgan, a veteran officer with 20 years of experience, had never seen anything like this. "There are no signs of struggle," she told her partner as they searched the bus. "No blood, no broken windows, nothing to suggest they were forced out." The strangest thing was how normal everything looked. The bus was parked perfectly straight, as if Mr. Jenkins had carefully pulled over for a planned stop. Student backpacks were neatly placed on seats. Some water bottles were half empty. A few snack wrappers showed that some students had been eating shortly before they disappeared. By nightfall, the forest road was lit up with police lights. Search teams with dogs spread out in all directions from the bus. Helicopters with thermal cameras scanned the dense forest from above. Parents gathered at the police station, their faces pale with worry as they waited for any news. "We found something," reported one of the search teams at 8:45 p.m. About 50 yards from the bus, in a small clearing, they discovered a circle of 16 sets of footprints. The prints showed that the students, Mrs. Wilson, and Mr. Jenkins had stood in a perfect circle, facing outward. From this circle, all footprints simply stopped. "It's as if they just vanished into thin air," said Officer Thompson, shining his flashlight on the edge of the footprint circle. The dogs followed the scent to this spot but became confused, walking in circles and whining. As news spread about the missing students, reporters arrived from neighboring cities. The morning news headlines read, "Entire CLS vanishes in forest mystery." The search continued through the night and into the next day. Parents brought photos of their children, sharing stories with police about what they were wearing, their habits, any information that might help find them. Maria Rodriguez, Tyler's mother, showed police a text her son had sent just 15 minutes before the estimated time of disappearance. It read, "Mom, something weird is happening. The forest is too quiet. Do you know if there are caves in this area? Some of us thought we heard strange noises coming from underground." This text became a crucial piece of evidence. Forest Creek Nature Reserve had no known cave systems, but the message prompted geologists to join the investigation. They'd brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan the area where the bus was found. By the afternoon of the second day, another unusual discovery added to the mystery. All 16 missing people had left their phones on the bus, except for one. Lucy Hall's phone was missing, and when police tried calling it, they received a signal. The phone was still somewhere in the forest, but strangely, it appeared to be moving. "The signal is weak but active," explained the technical expert tracking the phone. "It's moving about 2 miles per hour, heading deeper into the forest. But it's following no known trail." A specialized team was immediately dispatched to follow the phone signal. What they found at the location shocked everyone. Lucy's phone was there, placed carefully on top of a large flat rock, still turned on. On its screen was a photo that had been taken at 10:27 a.m. on the day of the disappearance. The photo showed all 15 students and Mrs. Wilson standing in that same circle formation found by their footprints. They were holding hands, their eyes closed, while Mr. Jenkins stood in the center. Behind them, barely visible through the trees, was a faint blue light. And scrawled in the dirt next to the phone were 5 words that sent chills through the search team. "Do not look for a U.S." The mystery had just deepened, and the small town of Millfield would never be the same again. 3 days after the disappearance, the small town of Millfield was transformed. Police cars lined the normally quiet streets. News vans with tall antennas crowded the town square. The school remained closed as the gymnasium became a command center for the search operation. FBI agent Marcus Reed arrived from the nearest field office, taking charge of the investigation. He stood in front of a large map of Forest Creek Nature Reserve, studying the area where the bus had been found. "We need to understand the significance of this blue light in the photo," he told the gathered officers. "Has anyone in the area reported seeing strange lights before?" To everyone's surprise, several hands went up. Old Mr. Peterson, who had lived on the edge of the forest for over 60 years, stepped forward. "Those lights have been showing up every few years since I was a boy," he said in his shaky voice. "My grandfather used to warn us never to follow them. Said they were forest spirits that led people away." Agent Reed tried to hide his skepticism. He was a man of facts and evidence, not folklore. But with 16 missing people and few leads, he couldn't afford to ignore any information. "I want every local story about these lights documented," he ordered. "And I want to know if there have been any other disappearances in this area over the past 50 years. The research team quickly found that 3 hikers had gone missing in 1982 and a family of 4 in 1997. Both cases remained unsolved. Both disappearances had happened in the same general area where the bus was found. Meanwhile, the forest search continued. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the search dogs began barking excitedly near a small stream about a mile from the bus location. There, partly hidden under some fallen leaves, was Mrs. Wilson's wristwatch. The time had stopped at exactly 10:27 a.m., the same time shown on Lucy's phone when the mysterious photo was taken. "The glass is cracked, but there's no blood," said the officer who found it. "And look at this." The officer pointed to the back of the watch. Someone had scratched a simple symbol into the metal, a circle with a dot in the center and 3 wavy lines beneath it. "What does it mean?" asked Agent Reed. No one knew, but by afternoon, the symbol had been identified in the archives of the local historical society. It appeared in Native American cave paintings from hundreds of years ago, found in the mountains nearby. According to the translation, it represented a doorway between worlds. The parents of the missing students grew increasingly frustrated with what seemed like strange turns in the investigation. Some began organizing their own search parties, despite warnings from authorities. "They're focusing on lights and symbols when they should be looking for kidnappers," cried Michael Chen, Emma's father, during a heated meeting with Agent Reed. "My daughter is out there somewhere." That night, something unexpected happened. All the parents of the missing students received the same text message at exactly 10:27 p.m. The messages came from their children's phones, the very phones that had been found on the abandoned bus and were now in police evidence bags. The message was simple: "We are safe. Time is different here. Don't look or us." When officers rushed to check the evidence room, they found all the students' phones still sealed in their bags, yet somehow the messages had been sent. Agent Reed ordered a technical analysis of the phones and the cell tower data. The results defied explanation. The messages had indeed come from these phones, but the signal had originated from somewhere underground, deep beneath Forest Creek. The forest rangers insisted there were no caves or underground structures in the reserve, but the ground-penetrating radar told a different story. About 50 feet below where the bus had been found, there appeared to be a large open space, a cavern that appeared on no official map. As preparations began for an underground exploration, the town held its breath. Were the missing students really safe, as the message claimed? And what did they mean that time is different where they were? The answers would be more shocking than anyone could imagine. On the 5th day after the disappearance, a specialized cave rescue team arrived in Millfield. They set up equipment near the spot where the ground radar had detected the underground cavern. Early morning fog hung over the forest as they prepared to enter the unknown space below. "This is highly unusual," said Dr. Helen Martinez, a geologist who specialized in cave formations. She studied the 3D images from the radar scan with a frown. "This cavern doesn't match any natural formation patterns I've ever seen. The walls are too smooth, too perfect." The team created an entry point by carefully drilling through the forest floor. When they broke through, cool air rushed up from below, air that smelled strangely like ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Agent Reed insisted on being the first to descend. Wearing a helmet with a powerful light, he was lowered down on a secure line. The radio crackled with his voice as he reached the bottom. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his tone showing rare amazement. "You need to see this for yourselves." What the team discovered over the next few hours stunned everyone. The cavern was not natural at all. It was a perfectly circular chamber about 40 feet across. The walls glowed with a faint blue light, the same color seen in the background of Lucy's photo. Strange symbols, including the one found on Mrs. Wilson's watch, covered the walls. Most shocking of all were the footprints. 16 sets of footprints led from the center of the room to the far wall, and then simply stopped at a solid rock surface. "It's as if they walked straight through the wall," said one of the rescue team members, touching the smooth stone surface where the footprints ended. When news of the underground chamber reached the town, reactions were mixed. Some parents were hopeful that this meant their children might still be alive. Others feared this strange discovery only meant something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, back in town, Sheriff Johnson was dealing with another strange development. Old Mrs. Harper, who lived in a cabin just outside the forest, came to the station with an old photograph from 1953. "I think you need to see this," she said, her hands shaking as she placed the yellowed photo on his desk. The black and white image showed a school group from 1953 standing in front of a bus. Sheriff Johnson was about to ask why this mattered when Mrs. Harper pointed to a figure in the back row. "That's Michael Brennan. He went missing with 5 other students back then. Everyone thought they had run away to the city." Sheriff Johnson stared at the photo in shock. The boy looked exactly like Tyler Rodriguez, one of the missing students. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. "There's more," said Mrs. Harper, pulling out a newer photo from 1987. "This is from the local newspaper. It shows workers who found those hikers that disappeared in 1982. Again, among the search team was a face that looked exactly like one of the missing students. This time, it was Emma Chen. When these photos reached Agent Reed at the cavern site, he ordered an immediate search of historical records from the area. The results were disturbing. Every few decades, people had disappeared in these woods. And in each case, people with identical faces to those missing appeared in photos years or even decades before they were born. By evening, a new theory was forming, one so bizarre that Agent Reed hesitated to share it with the families. But Dr. Martinez had no such hesitation. These symbols, she explained to the group of agents, appear in many ancient cultures. They all refer to the same concept: time loops or time distortions. I believe your missing students haven't just disappeared in space, they've disappeared in time. As if to confirm her theory, at exactly 10:27 p.m. that night, all electronic devices in Millfield briefly lost power. When they came back on seconds later, every screen, phones, computers, even the digital billboard in the town square, displayed the same message. The door opens every 34 years. We are trying to come home. The morning after the strange message appeared on every screen in Millfield, the town was in chaos. People gathered in small groups on street corners, talking in worried voices about what it all meant. News reporters crowded the town square, broadcasting live updates about the Millfield time mystery, as they now called it. Inside the high school library, Agent Reed met with Dr. Martinez and a new expert who had just arrived, Professor Alan Wright, who specialized in theoretical physics. The three of them sat surrounded by old books, maps, and printouts of the strange symbols from the underground chamber. "Let me understand this clearly," said Agent Reed, rubbing his tired eyes. "You're saying these 16 people might be trapped in some kind of time loop?" Professor Wright nodded, his gray beard moving up and down as he arranged papers on the table. "Based on the evidence, I believe they've fallen into what we call a temporal displacement event. The symbols in that chamber match ancient descriptions of places where time doesn't flow normally. Some cultures called them thin places where the barrier between different times becomes weak." Dr. Martinez pointed to her calculations. If the message is correct about the 34-year cycle, then the previous openings would have been in 1991, 1957, and 1923. A quick check of town records confirmed that unexplained disappearances had indeed happened in those years. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, something strange was happening at the site of the underground chamber. The blue glow had begun to pulse, growing stronger and then fading every few minutes. The scientists monitoring the site reported that each pulse came exactly 34 minutes apart. Back in town, parents of the missing students gathered at the community center. They had been shown the historical photos with faces that looked exactly like their children. Some refused to believe the time travel theory, calling it nonsense. Others grabbed onto this explanation, desperate for any hope that their children might return. "My daughter can't be stuck in another time," cried Mrs. Rodriguez, Tyler's mother. "She has to come home." As the day progressed, more strange events occurred. The town clock began running backward for short periods. People reported seeing brief glimpses of unfamiliar buildings where empty lots should be. An elderly man claimed he saw the missing school bus drive past his house, but when police arrived, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, Professor Wright had developed a theory about what was happening. "I believe the students are trying to communicate with us across time," he explained to Agent Reed. "These pulses, these glimpses, they're trying to find a way back, but they need our help." Just before sunset, a small group of researchers returned from the forest with an important discovery. Near the bus site, they had found a small metal box half buried in the ground. Inside was a handwritten journal. The writing was faded but clear enough to read. It was signed by Emma Chen, but the date on the first page was May 15, 1957. "We've been trying to get home for so long," the journal began. "Each time the door opens, only some of us can go through. The others must wait for the next cycle. We've learned how to leave messages across time, hoping someone will understand how to help us all return together." The journal explained that the students and their teacher had accidentally stepped through a time door when the blue light appeared in the forest. They had been scattered across different time periods, some in the past, some in what they described as sideways time. The final pages contained instructions for how to bring them all back at once during the next full opening of the time door. "The door will fully open at 10:27 p.m. on the 7th day after we disappeared," the journal read. "But it will only stay open for exactly 3 minutes. You must be ready." That was tomorrow night. The clock was ticking, and 16 lives depended on whether Professor Wright and Agent Reed could follow instructions written by a teenage girl lost in time. The town of Millfield had never seen such activity. As the sixth day since the disappearance dawned, government vehicles lined the main street. Scientists, agents, and specialists hurried between the high school and the forest site, carrying equipment and speaking in urgent tones. Inside the high school gymnasium, Professor Wright had set up what he called a temporal anchoring station. Strange devices with blinking lights and humming motors filled the space where basketball games were normally played. Parents watched nervously as technicians ran cables and adjusted settings. "Will this really bring our children back?" asked Mr. Chen, Emma's father, as he stared at the complicated equipment. Professor Wright looked up from his calculations. "Your daughter's journal gives us the best chance we have." Emma was very precise in her instructions. According to Emma's journal, they needed 3 things to open the time door properly. First, personal items belonging to each missing person. Second, a specific arrangement of lights matching the pattern on the chamber walls. And third, the exact tone or frequency that the blue light in the forest was emitting. "It's like tuning a radio to the right station," explained Dr. Martinez to the worried parents. "We need to match the frequency of the time door to pull them back to our present." Throughout the day, teams worked frantically to prepare everything. Parents brought cherished items from their children's rooms. Tyler's baseball cap, Emma's favorite book, Lucy's bracelet, and other personal belongings. These were arranged in a circle in the gymnasium, matching the circle formation where the students had disappeared. At the forest site, another team prepared the underground chamber. Following Emma's instructions, they carefully drew specific symbols on the floor using a mixture of forest soil and crushed crystals found near the chamber entrance. By late afternoon, a new problem emerged. The journal mentioned that all electronic devices would fail when the time door began to open. This meant their modern equipment might not work at the crucial moment. "We need a backup plan," insisted Agent Reed. "Something that doesn't rely on electricity." The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Wilson's husband remembered that his wife played the cello and had perfect pitch. The journal mentioned a specific musical note, D sharp in a particular octave, that matched the frequency of the blue light. "My daughter plays cello too," said Mr. Roberts, father of one of the missing students. "She has her mother's talent for perfect pitch." Within hours, a group of local musicians had gathered with acoustic instruments, no electronics that could fail. They practiced playing the specific tone that might help guide the missing people home. As evening approached, tension in Millfield reached its peak. At the gymnasium, families gathered holding candles. In the forest, Agent Reed and Professor Wright made final preparations in the underground chamber. The scientists had rigged a system of mirrors to reflect the blue light in the specific pattern Emma had described. At 10:00 p.m., exactly 27 minutes before the predicted opening, something unexpected happened. The town fell completely silent. Not just quiet, but utterly devoid of sound. Birds stopped singing. Wind seemed to freeze. Even the rustling of leaves ceased. In this eerie silence, people across town began to see strange images, like ghost photographs layered over reality. Many reported seeing the missing students, flickering in and out of view for just seconds at a time. They appeared older in some visions, younger in others, as if they were being seen across different times all at once. In the underground chamber, the blue light began to pulse faster. The air felt charged with electricity. Professor Wright checked his watch. 10:20 p.m. Just 7 minutes until the time door would supposedly open. "It's starting," he said, his voice barely audible in the strange, thick air. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes will determine whether they come home or stay lost forever." As 10:27 p.m. approached, the blue light grew blindingly bright. The symbols on the chamber walls began to glow, and the air itself seemed to bend and twist like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The time door was beginning to open. At exactly 10:27 p.m., the blue light in the underground chamber exploded outward in a silent wave. Just as Emma's journal had predicted, all electronic devices in Millfield went dead. Phones, computers, even car engines stopped working. The town was plunged into darkness except for the candles in the gymnasium and the pulsing blue glow now visible from the forest. In the gymnasium, the musicians began playing the D sharp note. The sound vibrated through the air, steady and pure. The personal items placed in the circle began to tremble slightly, as if responding to the music. "Keep playing," instructed Professor Wright's assistant, who had stayed behind while the professor went to the forest chamber. "Don't stop for anything." Outside, the night sky above Millfield changed. The stars seemed to blur and stretch, creating streaks of light across the darkness. People watching from their homes saw strange shadows moving across town, shadow buildings and shadow people that weren't really there, like memories of another time playing out on top of the present. In the underground chamber, Agent Reed and Professor Wright stood at the edge of the circle they had prepared. The blue light had concentrated at the center, forming what looked like a spinning whirlpool of light. "It's happening exactly as Emma described," whispered Professor Wright, his face illuminated by the blue glow. "The time door is opening." The whirlpool of light expanded, touching the edge of the circle. As it did, the solid stone wall where the footprints had stopped began to shimmer and become transparent. Through it, they could see what looked like a long tunnel with walls of shifting blue light. And then, amazingly, they saw movement in the tunnel, figures walking slowly toward them. Back in the gymnasium, the atmosphere changed. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The circle of personal items now glowed with the same blue light seen in the forest. Parents gasped as the light began to take shape, forming human-like figures above each personal item. "Tyler?" whispered Mrs. Rodriguez, reaching out toward the glowing shape above her son's baseball cap. The figure seemed to reach back, though its hand passed through hers like mist. In the forest chamber, the figures in the tunnel grew clearer. Agent Reed could now count 16 shapes moving toward them, the exact number of missing people. But something was wrong. They were moving too slowly, as if walking through thick mud. "They're struggling to reach us," said Professor Wright urgently. "The connection isn't strong enough." He pulled out Emma's journal, flipping to the final pages that they hadn't fully understood before. "There's something here about anchors. We need emotional anchors." At that moment, Agent Reed's radio crackled to life, the first electronic device to work since 10:27 p.m. It was the assistant from the gymnasium. "The shapes are forming here too," came the broken message. "But they're fading in and out. We can't hold them." Professor Wright suddenly understood. "The personal items aren't enough. We need the parents. Their connection is the strongest anchor. Get the parents to the forest site now." Agent Reed shouted into the radio. "We have less than 2 minutes left." What followed was a desperate race against time. Parents ran from the gymnasium toward the forest, guided by the increasingly bright blue glow. The musicians followed, still playing the crucial note that seemed to keep the time door stable. As the first parents reached the chamber entrance, the figures in the light tunnel had almost reached the transparent wall. Now their faces were visible. The missing students, Mrs. Wilson, and Mr. Jenkins, all looking exactly as they had when they disappeared, though their expressions showed exhaustion and fear. Emma Chen was at the front of the group. When she saw her father being lowered into the chamber, her face lit up with recognition. She pressed her hand against her side of the transparent barrier just as her father reached the bottom and ran to the same spot. As their hands met, separated only by the thinning barrier between times, a surge of blue energy pulsed through the chamber. The same happened as more parents arrived and found their children in the light tunnel. The barrier between present and wherever the missing people had been trapped was weakening. The time door was nearly open completely, but the clock was ticking. They had less than 1 minute left before it would close again for another 34 years. The final minute seemed to stretch endlessly as parents and children reached for each other across the thinning barrier. The blue light pulsed faster now, almost like a heartbeat. The musicians played louder, their note perfectly matching the frequency of the light. "It's working," shouted Professor Wright as the transparent wool began to dissolve where hands met hands. Small openings appeared, just large enough for fingers to touch across the divide between times. Emma Chen was the first to break through, her fingers interlaced with her father's, and suddenly the barrier around their connected hands disappeared completely. With a strong pull, Mr. Chen yanked his daughter forward. There was a flash of blue light, and Emma tumbled through into the present, falling into her father's arms. "Now, everyone pull together," commanded Agent Reed. The scene became a blur of motion and light. Parents grabbed their children's hands and pulled with all their strength. One by one, the students fell through the dissolving barrier. Tyler Rodriguez, Lucy Hall, and the others. Mrs. Wilson came through holding the hands of two students whose parents couldn't make it to the site in time. But something was wrong. Mr. Jenkins, the bus driver, remained behind the barrier, too far from the opening to reach through. "We need to get him too," shouted Mrs. Wilson, reaching back toward him. The light was pulsing dangerously fast now. Professor Wright checked his watch. Just 20 seconds left before the time door would close. "Jenkins, run forward now," Agent Reed called through the shrinking opening. The bus driver rushed toward them, but the tunnel behind him seemed to be collapsing, the blue light fading to darkness. Just as he reached the opening, it began to close rapidly. In a final desperate move, two of the students and Agent Reed reached through, grabbed Mr. Jenkins by his jacket, and pulled with all their might. With a sound like thunder, he came crashing through the barrier just as it sealed shut behind him. The blue light gave one final, blinding pulse, and then vanished completely. The chamber went dark except for the flashlights and candles people had brought. In the sudden silence that followed, 16 people who had been missing for a week lay on the chamber floor, surrounded by their loved ones. They were back. As dawn broke over Millfield the next morning, the town began to hear the incredible story of what had happened to the missing 16. They gathered in the high school auditorium, still wearing the same clothes they had disappeared in, though for them, the experience had been much longer than 7 days. "We were trapped in a place where time moved differently," explained Mrs. Wilson, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "What was a week for you felt like years for us." The students described being pulled through the time door when they had followed the strange blue light in the forest. They had found themselves scattered across different time periods, some in Millfield's past, others in what they called shadow times that seemed like alternative versions of their town. "I was in 1957, said Emma, explaining how she had written the journal and buried it where she knew it would be found in the future. "I saw my own grandmother as a young girl." "I was in a Millfield that never existed," added Tyler, one where the town had become a huge city. Over time, they had found each other and learned how the time door worked. They discovered they weren't the first to be trapped. Others from previous disappearances had left clues and messages to help them. Medical examinations showed something remarkable. Although the 16 believed they had experienced years in the time loop, their bodies showed no signs of aging beyond the 7 days they had been gone. As reporters crowded outside the town, eager for the story, the people of Millfield formed a protective circle around the returned. What had happened would never be fully understood by science. The town knew the truth. Professor Wright gathered his equipment, preparing to leave. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy," he quoted with a small smile. "These 16 people have experienced something beyond our current understanding." Life in Millfield would eventually return to normal, though the town would never forget the week when 16 people vanished and then returned with impossible stories. And deep in Forest Creek Nature Reserve, the underground chamber was sealed and marked with warnings. For in 34 years, the blue light would return, and the time door would open once more,